Most people are familiar with the main three men who tried to succeed Edward the Confessor: Harold Godwinson, Harold Hardrada, and William of Normandy. But did you know there was actually an obscure fourth claimant who did not rush to defeat his rivals, but played a longer game through marriage and court intrigue? His name was Edgar the Ætheling, son of Edward the Ætheling and grandson of King Edmund Ironside. The Aetheling's life is shrouded in obscurity, which is very, very strange considering this heritage. Edmund Ironside was the son of Ethelred the Unready, who was himself Edward the Confessor's father. This makes Edgar the Ætheling the great-nephew of Edward the Confessor, and the next in line to the Wessex house. But then why was this candidate, who was clearly the most legitimate through blood to the throne, not just unsuccessful in his bid to succeed Edward, but so overlooked in the historical record? Like many of the other videos on this channel, to explore this properly we have to go back to the Danish invasions of King Sweyn. In 1013, King Sweyn's invasion would force King Ethelred to flee from England. He would go to Normandy, but just a year later King Sweyn died in York whilst going to the city for his first national address. English nobles had travelled to the city for this reason, but they now sat at a funeral wondering what would happen next. The Danish army elected Sweyn's son Canute as the next king, but the English nobles saw no reason to reiterate. Their pledge of allegiance did not extend to Sweyn's son. They were, however, not keen on Ethelred taking back his throne. Nevertheless, they sent word to Normandy to request the exiled Ethelred back to the throne on the condition that he would rule justly. Ethelred accepted, and he returned on the request that he would not face any treachery. Upon Ethelred's return, Canute's army would be dealt a huge blow, and Ethelred was put back on the throne. Problems in Ethelred's court continued, however, particularly around the tension between Ethelred's eldest son Edmund, soon to be the Ironside, and his bitter rivalry with Ethelred's main henchman, Edric. These tensions prevented an effective and cohesive response when Canute eventually returned and marauded into Wessex. Edmund tried to organise effective resistance, but Edric deserted to the Danes, and before long most of the country lay in Canute's hands. Edmund retreated to London to be with his ailing father, and Ethelred died shortly afterwards. From here, Edmund Ironside would be elected by the people of London as king, and he would fight 4 successful battles to repel the Danish attackers. He liberated Wessex and lifted the siege on London. However, Edmund was tragically defeated at Sundun on October 1016. He agreed to divide the realm, where mercy would go to Canute and he would keep Wessex, but he died in November, so Canute got a total victory. Edmund's 2 sons, Edward and Edmund, probably fled to Sweden. The record is very murky, and little is known of the brothers' journey, however. What likely happened is that the King of Sweden took pity on Edward and his brother and gave them asylum. Then, at some point, they made their way to Hungary. At some point, Edward married Agatha, and they had 3 children, Edgar, Margaret, and Christina. Edmund, the eldest of the 2 brothers, eventually died in exile, so Edward became the chief inheritor. After Godwin's rebellion of 1052, the succession of Duke William of Normandy was put into doubt, and in 1056, Edward was recalled to England from Hungary after King Edward the Confessor discovered he was there. He arrived in 1057, but died soon after, leaving his son Edgar the Ætheling as a potential heir. There may have been a party supporting his ascension to the throne once the Confessor died, but he lacked remaining familial ties in the country, as his mother was a foreigner. He was also only 14 years old, and nobody sufficiently powerful enough in the kingdom supported him over Earl Harold Godwinson. Despite the fact that he by far had the closest blood relation to the late King Edward the Confessor, the young Edgar's age and his family's estrangement from the kingdom for decades meant that he was sidelined in favour of a process based around standing in power among the nobility, as well as closeness to the late king. The Aetheling was still the direct descendant of the Wessex royal line, however, the great-grandson of Edward the Unready, and the great-great-great-great-great-grandson of Alfred the Great. The most support that the Aetheling ever got was in the initial struggle that came after the Battle of Hastings. Archbishop Eldred of York wished for him to become king. The chronicle believes that this was his proper due by birth. Earls Edwin and Morcar also offered him some support, but by Christmas of 1066, these two, as well as Archbishop Eldred, had submitted to William of Normandy. We see that Edgar Ætheling's claim did not get very far at all, but he was still the most legitimate candidate left. This isn't saying much, since it was either him or William of Normandy, but his blood claim to the throne persisted. It was taken seriously after Hastings, even if just for a moment, and quickly eroded. Under the new regime, in 1067, he may have briefly participated in King William's court. William of Poitiers recorded that he was treated as one of William's dearest companions. However, perhaps a reminder to take such partisan sources as William of Poitiers with a pinch of salt, Edgar was stripped of his honours at some point, when he fled to King Malcolm of Scotland's court in 1068. Historian Nicholas Hooper believes that Edgar was not present at the Witchen Revolt of 1068, but that he did lead the men of York in the revolt of 1069, which drove the Normans from the city. This revolt was eventually defeated, and Edgar fled again to Scotland. King Malcolm of Scotland saw Edgar's existence as the rightful heir as a pretext to invade Norman England. He did in 1072, but the Normans retaliated later that year. In order to avoid the Normans, Edgar Ætheling briefly fled to Flanders, and he returned to Scotland in 1074. Here, he was eventually persuaded by King Malcolm to go to Normandy to make peace with William. Prior to this, Edgar's sister Margaret married Malcolm, which linked the Scottish royal family with the old Wessex line. Here, Edgar Ætheling seems to disappear from the historiography. He may have travelled to the Byzantine Empire and participated in the Varangian Guard. He next returns to the historiography when England was ruled by William Rufus, or William II, and here Edgar Ætheling becomes a companion of the king's brother and Duke of Normandy, Robert Curthose. After Robert Curthose invades Normandy in 1091, Aetheling was forced again into exile, and to be deprived of his Norman estates and friends. This suggests that William feared an alliance between Edgar and Robert. This fear ultimately stems from the fact that Edgar had blood legitimacy to the English throne, which could gather support against the king, which still showed now, 25 years after the conquest, Edgar still possessed an aura grounded in his relation to distant King Alfred that shuddered even kings. Edgar continued to advise King Malcolm in his war against Rufus in 1093 until he died and Duncan took power. After Duncan died just a year later in 1094, Malcolm and Margaret's son Edgar was recognised by King Rufus as the next king. Edgar later took up the cross and involved himself in the First Crusade, where his participation is largely lost to time. Edgar Ætheling eventually returned from the Middle East, and he once again allied himself with Robert Curthose, Duke of Normandy. But they were defeated, however, by Henry I, who was now King of England, at the Battle of Tewkesbury, 1106. King Henry treated him leniently, and he was pardoned. His dynastic significance continued under England's new king, as his niece, Edith, daughter of Malcolm and Margaret, married King Henry I. Therefore, King Henry's son, Prince William Aetheling, held the blood of Edgar's family and of the Wessex line. The young prince was destined to return the line of English kings to the House of Wessex, which was a product of Edgar's relationship with Scotland and keeping his bloodline secured through his sister. It seems as though Edgar had managed to steer the House of Wessex back into the crosshairs of English nobility, but this unfortunately never happened. The White Ship disaster of 1120 saw William Aetheling drowned, and with it the last proper chance to restore what was lost from the Danish invasion all those years ago. The Aetheling was still alive by this point, and as late as 1125, it was said that he was living peacefully in the countryside. He did die shortly after this account, however, having lived a long life created and ended in mystery, uncertainty, and loss. His life began with him far away from his grandfather's lost kingdom, and ended with the last of his bloodline tragically dead. He had been the true heir by blood ever since his father passed away in 1057, but was just never able to muscle his way into his rightful position as successor to Alfred the Great.